Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at the legal and ethical obligations of writers. We are going to be learning about the various different laws and ethical considerations that journalists and writers need to be aware of and how that might or might not impact on them. We're also going to be learning about how the press is regulated and who are the different organisations that are involved in regulating the press. And finally, we will be looking at the debate of free press or freedom of the press, what this means, what you might think of it, because it is a widely debatable term. People have their own opinions about it. This video is going to be really important for you to be able to meet the Learning Aim 3 of Unit 26, which is the first unit we're going to cover. It's mainly going to be useful for these last two bullet points here. Be aware of legal constraints and ethical constraints, but there is a little bit of an overlap for these first three bullet points, but these are going to be the two main ones. So, the first thing we need to look at is what the difference is between legal and ethical obligations. So, when we're talking about something that is legal, we're talking about something that is written into law. Okay, there is a specific piece of legislation that is in place to stop this particular practice in happening. So if we're talking about something that is a law or legal, it's something that is basically essentially legal or illegal to do. Okay, that one's nice and straightforward. Whereas ethical, though, that's where the water can become a little bit more muddy and a little bit more sort of vague. So when we're talking about ethics, we mean whether something is morally right or morally wrong to do. Ethics refers to a set of moral principles that governs a particular person's actions. So it's not necessarily looking at something that you can and can't do. It's more looking about whether you should or shouldn't do the thing that it is referring to. So they're not specific laws that are in place, but it's more about how you would expect a particular person to behave in a certain field. So we're going to be looking at what the different ethical obligations are that impact on journalists and how those ethical practices are guided, I suppose. So the first thing we're going to look at is the legal obligations first, because they're quite clear and quite set in stone. So we're going to look at 6 different pieces of legislation and what they mean for journalists and how they may impact on the way a journalist conducts themselves in their role. So we're going to look at defamation, we're going to look at contempt, copyright, protection of children and young persons, confidentiality and privacy, and official secrets. We'll look at a couple of examples as well for journalists, or in some cases publications, that have broken these laws. Some of them are quite common, some of them are a bit more rare. So let's start off then with looking at defamation. So defamation, which is controlled by the Defamation Act 2013, is essentially to make a false claim about someone or a group of people or an organization, for example. It can sometimes be known as libel as well. So this is probably one of the most common pieces of legislation that is broken, especially from tabloid newspapers. Defamation can be classed as anything that has potential to expose a person to be hated, ridiculed, or contempt by society, cause someone to be shunned or avoided, or lower the person in the estimation of right-thinking members of society, or disparage the person in their business, trade, or profession. So it is essentially to make a false claim about someone that causes them to be ostracized from society, or criticized, or harassed in any way. There are quite a lot of examples of newspapers that have broken the Defamation Act and libeled someone. Quite a well-known example is this man here called Christopher Jeffries, who in 2011, I think it was, he was the landlord of a house, and one of his tenants called Joanna Yates was murdered, and he was taken into the police for questioning. And the tabloid newspapers got hold of that, and they produced this sort of content here, which is obviously not the most positive way you might represent someone in a newspaper. You've got the strange Mr. Jeffries there, Joe suspected peeping Tom, and the only information they had on them was that he'd been taken in for questioning, and he was found to be not guilty. But obviously all these headlines and newspapers here, the way they're reported, is likely to cause people to assume that he is guilty. Okay, whereas in reality he had nothing to do with it. So basically, this is a good example of defamation. Okay, they had to pay libel damages to Christopher Jeffries, so obviously they were found to have broken the law. But there's plenty of other examples of newspapers who have broken the Defamation Act and libelled someone. Okay, contempt is governed by the Contempt of Court Act from 1981, and this is essentially where any publication, if they were to report something that impacted on the way a trial is ran, then that is causing contempt. So, for example, you might print something that might change the way a juror might think, or they might make the trial become unfair, or even in some cases trying to influence jurors. Say for example this particular man was taken to court, okay, and you had all these different newspapers here. That is likely to influence the way a juror might feel who's on the trial. Okay, so contempt focuses on the reporting of trials and the press. Includes the publications of material that might cause a fair trial to become prejudice, interviewing a witness before a trial as well, or pressuring to provide an interview, or opposition or defiance towards authority, justice and dignity of the courts. Okay, it all comes back to the idea of making sure that the court is, seen with a sense of dignity. Okay, it doesn't want to impact on or sway the way trials are run, because that sort of defeats the point of them. Okay, quite a few examples with regards to contempt of court, but I'll find some more examples for you to make it a bit easier for you. Okay, copyright. This is the one where I've tripped people up in the past. So copyright is governed by the Copyright Designs and Patents Act. Now what we're talking about here is we're talking about copyright spelt C-O-P-Y-R-I-G-H-T, not copyright spelt C-O-P-Y-R-W-R-I-T-E, sorry, I'm a blank there. And this one refers not necessarily to publications, but also actual writers themselves. And I'm sure you all know what we mean by copyright, okay? But it's the same as you might think about copyright with regards to other industries such as music or film or TV. And it's the idea that the person who creates content, so in this case a writer, a journalist, they will have the exclusive right to that particular piece of writing. Okay, there's no unauthorized copying to be allowed with that piece of work, and it makes sure that the original writer has got the right to that particular piece of work. So essentially we're talking about plagiarism. Okay, and to be fair, there's not been that many high-profile examples of copyright laws being broken in journalism. This is the only example really that I could find, and this was from 2012. So that's quite an old example of a journalist who has been accused and found guilty of plagiarism, okay, or copyright essentially. Okay, it's more well known in industries such as music. But for journalism, for newspapers, it's not as common as you might think it is. Okay, so now we're going to move on to looking at the protection of children and young persons. This legislation, and what we're looking at it for, it's all about anonymity, essentially. Okay, it's the idea that publications are not, who are involved in court cases, are not allowed to have any personal information about them published by the press. So you're looking at names, addresses, schools, photographs, but also any other information that could allow someone to be identified. Okay, so for example, it might be things like I don't know off the top of my head, to be honest. It could be any sort of personal information that, on the face of it, is not that revealing, but in sort of combining that information with other information, it could allow people to work out who a particular story is talking about. So it's all about protecting anonymity. There are a few other examples of a few issues that are in place that will completely waiver that anonymity. So it can be published in some cases. The main one really though is the idea of public interest. Okay, if it's, for example, quite a serious crime that the public need to be aware of, then it can sometimes be waived, but most of it will need to be done by the court's permission first, or even if something like the police are looking for someone, okay, they can publish information that can help them be identified. Okay, so there can be some circumstances where the legislation can be waived. Okay, so a good example of that, it's not on the slideshow, would be, for example, this is way before your time, you're talking about early 1990s here, would be the murder of James Bulger, who, if you don't know, was a 4 or 5 year old kid who got kidnapped and killed by two young lads who were 10 and 12-ish, around that age. I think it was in Liverpool somewhere. But because of the seriousness of the crime, and because it was a public interest story, because it was a massive, massive news story in the 1990s, the names of the two lads who were involved in it was published. Okay, so there can be some situations where it can be waived. Okay, confidentiality and privacy is another big issue in newspapers, and we will look at this a bit more when we look at privacy as well, and when we look at freedom of the press. So this is governed by the European Convention on Human Rights, and it prevents the reporting of any of the following without permission first. So personal or sexual lives, finances, information about their health, and filming in their house without permission, and sometimes public places. So funerals are a good example of that. Okay, a lot of time if it's quite a well-known story, journalists will try and gain access to people's funerals, or weddings as well can be another example of that. But that's illegal without permission. Again, there are a couple of reasons for these laws to be waived, similar to the protection of children and young persons, and that is whether the courts deem that story to be in public interest or not. Now that is a massive, massive debate, and we will get onto that in a little bit later on, and that's down to the courts, okay, whether they feel it will be in public interest. So again, you're talking about crime, any information that might protect the public, or anything that might particularly mislead the public. So it's about debating what is public interest or not. This is an example here of a cricket player who was found to be fixing matches, okay, and being corrupt essentially, and taking bungs for certain, performances on the cricket pitch. He was filmed on the cover. Now on the face of it, that would be filming this information here, breaking this information here about filming someone in their house, but because it was a crime, it was interpreted as public interest, okay? People had the right to know that stuff, okay? However, you'd probably say that if someone wanted to go and take pictures of a wedding or a funeral, that would not be in the public interest. Therefore, it's unlikely for the courts to allow that to be deemed public interest or not. Last one we're going to look at is official secrets, which is governed by the Official Secrets Act. Now again, there's not a lot of examples of times where this particular act has been breached by journalists or by newspaper publications, whatever, but this protects any information that is deemed confidential from being published. So it could be something like leaked documents from security agencies or intelligence services like MI5, MI6, GCHQ, whatever, anything that could jeopardize security or national security at that. The interesting thing about that is that even if it is deemed public interest, then that doesn't count for matters of official secrets. okay? Regardless of the information, it can't be published. It's illegal for it to be published, okay? Now, obviously, these days, that's quite tricky for when you've got platforms like Twitter available to you or other websites, but for mainstream media like newspapers or other news publications, it's very, very tricky to do. So there's not that many examples of this particular act being broken. There was one from the 80s around the Falklands wartime. The only other one really that you could argue could potentially have broken the official secrets was where the News of the World from the phone hacking scandal in 2011, which you might know about, were found to have hacked the phones of the royal family, so Prince William, for example, okay, and the families of dead soldiers. Now, that could potentially have broken into that official secrets, but not officially. So there's no massive main examples of that, but it's still important to know about, okay? So it is illegal for anything that is deemed confidential or a threat to national security for that to be published. So that's it for the legal obligations, okay? They're the main pieces of legislation that you need to know about, okay? Don't forget, when we're talking about legislation, we basically just mean a law that has been written, okay? So this here is the legislation that contains all the various laws. So we also now need to move on to looking at ethical obligations. So don't forget, when we're talking about ethics, we mean something that is morally right or wrong. So other than the laws that we've mentioned before, there is no other specific laws that impact on journalism. However, there are two organisations that we need to look at that regulate the way press behaves, okay? So the first one we're going to look at is this company here, IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation. So the IPSO are the regulators for all UK press. So you're looking at newspapers, you're looking at magazines, you're looking at websites, so web versions of newspapers, so like the Mail Online or the Sun website or whatever. So all online formats. Now, a regulator is basically someone who will moderate the way that a particular publication behaves. They've not been around that long. They were formed in 2014. This was a direct response to the phone hacking scandal, because this particular role was formed by a company called the PCC, which is the Press Complaints Commission. So what they do is, essentially, they offer a platform for the public. Okay, they offer public the chance to complain about malpractice from newspapers and magazines. So if, say, for example, you're in the unfortunate situation where a newspaper might write an article about you that you don't think is fair, then you can complain to IPSO and they will investigate for you. Okay, they have set rules that they expect newspapers and magazines to follow. Okay, and if it's found that newspapers and magazines have broken these codes or breached any of them, then they can instruct that publication to make changes and make apologies and issue, retractions of the information. So I'm not going to go through the entire code because a lot of it is pretty self-explanatory, but these are the various different clauses that are on their code of practice. So you've got accuracy, privacy, intrusion into grief or shock, reporting suicide, children in sex cases, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But these are the way that they expect a journalist to behave. What you can do, which is great for looking for examples that you will need to look at for your assignment, is you can go onto their website and you can see a list of all the different cases that they have gotten involved in and what the outcomes of those cases were. So you can see here, just by looking at some of the people who are involved, you've got some pretty well-known publications that are in there. This is the first page. There's about 45 pages of these things here. So you've got the Times, you've got the Express, Daily Star, the Scotsman, Express again there. Okay, you probably see the Daily Mail on there a few times. Okay, in fact, I know you do. You see them all the time on there. So you can go back and look at the different examples, and you can look at what the outcome was as well. So all of these ones here, where it says ipso mediation, that means that ipso got involved. Okay, it tells you what clauses were potentially broken as well. So you can see here this one. Let's look at this one here. Clattenburg versus Daily Star. You can see that these two codes, accuracy and privacy, were the ones that were potentially broken. And the outcome was they were broken because it says there, resolved ipso mediation. So you can click on that and it'll tell you a bit more information about it, which is really, really good for your examples. Okay, the other organisation we're going to look at is the National Union of Journalists. Now this one is sort of a little bit of the polar opposite of ipso. Whereas ipso is there to protect the public, National Union of Journalists is there to protect journalists. You probably should all know what a union does, because there's unions for pretty much every profession you can think of. There's unions for teaching staff, there's unions for NHS staff. Pretty much every industry in the world, or especially in the UK, will have a union there to protect members of that particular industry. So they're there to ensure fair working conditions, health and safety, pay, equality, all that sort of stuff. If you're a journalist and you find that your newspaper is asking you to do something that you don't want to do, maybe something that could be breaking the law or breaking the ipso code of practice, they will help you. They will help you in those matters. So they might do things like fund legal support for you. Okay, they're also a chief defender of press freedom, but we'll come back to that in a second. Just like the ipso, the National Union of Journalists, they've got their own code of conduct as well, which they expect members to follow. To be fair, it's pretty similar to the ipso code of conduct. Okay, it's the usual stuff for that accuracy, inaccuracies, fact and opinion. Okay, obtains material from honest, straightforward, and open means. Blah 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 blah. There's loads of examples there. And all members essentially would have to agree to this. So if you were an NUJ member and you were asking for help and it was found that you had breached one of these particular codes, then they probably wouldn't help you, because you say, well, hang on, you broke clause, 12, because you copied someone's work. Okay, so all NUJ members essentially agree to this when they become a member of the NUJ. Okay, now we're going to move on to the big debate, which is the idea of freedom of the press. Freedom of the press is essentially the idea that journalists should be free to write pretty much whatever they want. Okay, it's the right to freedom of expression. Okay, when we're talking about freedom of the press, we're not just talking about newspapers. Okay, we're talking about freedom of expression in every walk of life, whether it's communications, whether it's art, whether it's just general conversation with people. And it links back to the idea of free speech, really. Okay, now one of the things that's quite interesting when I was researching this stuff is the UK is currently ranked at 35th in the World Press Freedom ranking. Okay, we have less press freedom than we might think compared to especially countries in Scandinavia. Okay. However, obviously there's some countries, especially you'll find in places that are ran by dictatorships like North Korea or Turkmenistan or Syria, okay, around the Middle East area, that have pretty much no press freedom at all. So you got this little map here, and the colour key for the map is anything that's sort of like a pale yellow colour have a lot of press freedom, and then the more yellow you get, the less press freedom you have, moving to orange, to red, and then finally to black, which is pretty much essentially no press freedom at all. So it is quite interesting to look at this website and look at what countries have press freedom. So you're seeing a lot of Middle Eastern, Asian countries and North African countries that have quite limited press freedom. Russia, China, okay, South America as well, okay, Mexico as well, which is surprising. We do have a higher ranking than the US, I think, off the top of my head. I can't remember what the US is. It's certainly lower than us, though, so it's well worth looking at in terms of, to what extent the UK has press freedom. So it is a really, really interesting debate that is one that is still ongoing, and it's one that is never really probably going to have an outcome for it or not. So there's a lot of arguments that support press freedom, okay, and the main one really is it's in the European Convention of Human Rights that states that everyone has the right to freedom of expression, no matter what their views are, okay, no matter how extreme they might be, you have the right to express your opinions, okay. A lot of people also say as well that freedom of the press is one of the key ways to inform the public of public interest stories, uncovering corruption, crime, government, that sort of stuff, okay. We should be, say for example, you're looking at things like using the newspaper to criticise the state, so the government, for example, okay, you have the right to do that, okay, and it allows the public to be aware of truth, okay, the information should be out there, and the idea that an unfree press is basically one other way for the state or the government to be able to control what information the public are having access to, okay. So that's one of the main arguments for it. It allows people to be free to express themselves, okay. It's one of the privileges of living in a democracy, okay. Readers can also make up their own mind of what they read, okay. It's the idea that you could read something and you could not necessarily believe it, you can reject it, okay. So there's quite a lot of very strong arguments for press freedom, though there are some arguments against it as well, okay. Maybe not to the extent of something like China or North Korea, which has pretty much no press freedom, but the biggest argument really is that it can lead to unlawful or unethical journalism, okay. One of the biggest scandals certainly in this country with the news over the last maybe 10 years is the phone hacking scandal, okay. Now, I'm not going to go over all this now because we'll probably do a bit more on this in class, because it was a massive scandal which broke numerous laws and numerous ethical practices. But the main argument was that the News of the World were using the idea of press freedom to do whatever they wanted, essentially, and print whatever they want, okay. It's a very, very loose term, okay. Publications can exploit press freedom to publish news that isn't necessarily of the public interest, okay. So things like celebrity sex scandals, all the stuff that might necessarily sell papers, okay. And that is what led to the phone hacking scandal, okay. They claimed that what they were doing was, basically the News of the World were found to have hacked the phones of people, which is illegal, and they used the argument of free press to justify why they did it, okay. Obviously as well, given the fact that people might have press freedom, that could lead to platforms for extreme views, okay. Someone could use a publication to project far right or far left opinions, okay, which is again something that is very debatable as well, and that could be shielded under the use of free press, and that's one of the big debates, isn't it? To what extent, should free press be in place? Because there are a lot of positives and a lot of negatives to it, okay? And it is a really, really interesting debate. It is one that is going to be around for a long time, okay? There's never really going to be an answer to the idea of free press, because if you stifle free press, then you're stifling people's free speeches. Whereas if you offer too much free press, then it could lead to other unethical and unlawful practices and be used as a platform for extreme views. So it's going to be really interesting to know where you stand on free press. Do you agree with it? Do you think that writers should have the power to write whatever they want? Do you think there needs to be more regulation? Okay. Do you think that writers shouldn't be able to write what they want? Okay, there is no real right or wrong answer. It's all down to your own opinion. Okay, your belief. I have my opinions. I'm not going to go through them now because it's not the time or the place. But it's something that I think people should have their own opinions on. Okay, so it's something that's going to be very, very interesting. So have a think. Where do you stand with press freedom? Okay. Right, that's pretty much it for this video. Like I said before, this is going to be really, really useful for your... Where the hell is it now? It's here. Assessment Objective 3, okay, especially these two, okay, because in your assignment, you're going to need to make sure not only you're aware of the different legal and ethical obligations, so these things here, but also apply them to examples as well, okay, detailed examples. All right, so that's it. I'll see you later.